Okay, so this presentation is based on the report and asks the very basic question, are livestock always bad for the planet? The short answer to this question is no, but it depends which livestock and where. The other question we want to ask is this an important question? And I want to say definitively yes. Climate change is important, but also livestock production is really important across the world. So where does the narrative come from that livestock, milk, meat, and other products from livestock are bad for the planet? We've seen a variety of different commentators, some of them very famous and very influential, a bunch of different commissions, NGOs, campaign groups, commercial organizations make the case on the basis of a variety of different data sources that livestock is contributing very significantly to climate change, and that the solution to this is to reduce the consumption of meat and milk, to remove livestock from rangelands, and shift to different types of production system and different types of diet that involve plant-based diets, and very often the idea of industrially manufactured, cultured meat and milk. So where does this data come from, this narrative come from? It comes from science. It comes from a particular type of science, and a couple of major reports coming out of the FAO have done some detailed analyses of livestock impacts on climate across the globe. Yes, differentiated by region, yes, differentiated by inputs and outputs into the system, but coming with these aggregate figures that suggest, and this is the iconic figure from the most recent 2013 report, that 14.5% of total greenhouse gas emissions come from livestock. This is a lot. And those concerned with meeting the Paris Agreement targets think that focusing on land use, focusing on livestock is a really important route ahead. And it probably is, but again, which livestock and where? So where do all these figures come from, and how does the science evolve around it? A lot of this emerges out of what are called life cycle assessments. These are detailed analyses of the inputs and outputs of a livestock system, from the farming production end through processing and retailing to consumers, to analyze the greenhouse gas emission impacts of that production system. And the type of analyses that have been done often result in these big figures. So we've got this figure on greenhouse gas emissions across the supply chain from different types of food from Our World in Data. Very influential set of figures repeated in media outputs across the world. What are the biggest emitters? Beef, lamb, mutton, cheese, cattle-based dairy, of all forms of food. Well, what's the argument that follows from this? We need to shift our diets. A really influential paper by two researchers from Oxford University, Poor and Nemeczek, came out in Science, big, high-profile science journal, in 2018. And they made the case that a major shift in diet and a major shift in land use, the figure at the top is from them as well. More than 80% of farmland is used for livestock, but it only produces X% of food calories and protein. A major shift in our diet and land use is a really important thing to deal with global climate change. The Guardian headline coming out of that paper was, "Avoiding meat and dairy is perhaps the single biggest way to reduce your impact on planet Earth." Dramatic stuff, important data, but as I'll argue, limited. So what does this mean in the context where we work, in Tunisia, in Kenya, in Sardinia, in India? Well, I would argue that actually the story is very different. Poor and Nemeczek derived their analysis from 38,000 farms, most of which were in North America, Europe, and parts of Latin America. They weren't from these type of settings where most most pastoral and extensive livestock production happens. So what we do in the report is we delve into where do these figures come from, these iconic figures, the 14.5% and so on. And when you delve a bit deeply into the analysis, you realize that there are lots of gaps and lots of assumptions in these mainstream assessments based on these particular types of life cycle analyses. And this is influencing the narratives that we hear from campaign groups and famous people, influencing the wider policy agenda. So there are biases in the data. Most of it, as I said, coming not from extensive pastoral systems or small-scale livestock systems, but from industrial systems. There's the use of so-called default emission factors from the IPCC, which are often thought to be inaccurate for pastoral systems. There's a big debate about how we calculate carbon dioxide equivalents, depending on the type of gas that is emitted. Methane is the major gas from livestock production, but that's a short-lived gas compared to carbon dioxide, which is a long-lived gas. Big influences on global warming potentials. How do we understand the system that's being understood? How do we understand efficiency, for example? A big question is the question that are the climate impacts per unit of product of meat or milk, or per unit of area, or in relation to labor, or in relation to landscape? These are big questions about how you frame and define the system. Same applies to understanding the role of livestock in the carbon cycle. Highly complicated with lots of spatial and temporal dynamics. And of course, livestock, particularly in extensive systems, may have wider benefits, both of carbon sequestration, but also other ecosystem services that are derived from landscape benefits, from inputs into provision of biodiversity, from water services and so on. And then when these calculations are done, when we understand what are the impacts on climate change at a global level, we have to ask, well, what are the baselines and the alternatives that are being imagined in these assessments? For example, here's a picture of a rangeland in Amdo, Tibet. What are the alternative land uses here, if not being used for yak production in this case? Very often the imaginary is to replace rangelands with trees, tree planting exercises, which will sequester carbon. But very often in the marginal lands where many pastoral production systems operate, this is not feasible. And what happens when you remove livestock from an ecosystem? What will replace it? Well, very often it will be other forms of ungulate, other forms of ruminant, which will be producing methane as well. Or it may be termites or other forms of animal that will result in emissions. So it's not that nothing will happen, that you will return to zero. You've got to compare sensibly. And equally, this is the case with questions of dietary pattern. So if you replace meat and milk with high protein plant products, well, what are the emission consequences of using soy for tofu? What are the emission and environmental consequences of using industrial cultured meat? All of these questions are raised by looking at the assumptions that deliver the figures, that deliver the narrative. So we have to question the narrative, particularly for pastoral and extensive systems. And this is particularly the case where we think about how we understand an ecosystem and the relationship of livestock and carbon flows and greenhouse gas emissions. And this study from CIRAD based on analysis of a mobile pastoral system in northern Senegal, is a really interesting study, which shows that if you take a wider systems perspective, the carbon balance in this setting was more or less in balance and actually negative, i.e. there was sequestration was going on, particularly in certain seasons. So taking a wider ecosystems view suggests a different outcome, particularly in extensive systems. So a different type of methodology. So thinking about pastoralists and thinking about the context within which we work, the report comes up with 6 conclusions, recommendations, if you like. First, the importance of thinking about the production process, comparing industrial versus extensive production, not just the product. It's the process that's important. There's the need to improve data and challenge some of the assumptions in the global assessments in the ways that I've just described. There's a need to think with pastoralists about the practical solutions to mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, not from just through getting rid of livestock and planting trees, but thinking about manure management, thinking about mobility, thinking about sequestration. There's a need to get away from these generic global recommendations that we see in these narratives and think about much more particularly what it means for different types of people. So for example, saying that people should shift away from meat and milk may substantially undermine the nutritional access for undernourished populations in large portions of the world. We must be aware of the quick fix alternatives that are often suggested, the techno fixes of cultured meat and industrially produced meat and milk, and the quick fix alternatives that suggest that there are easy ways of replacing livestock and people with more carbon friendly alternatives. And above all, we need to think through all of this in relation to the wider political economy of these transformations, because unless we bring pastoralists into the center of these debates, we won't get a shift in the way the conversation is happening about climate change and wider food systems. And this is important, and important especially this year, because we've got the COP26 later in the year, we've got in September the United Nations Food Systems Summit, and we've got ongoing deliberations within the IPCC. But too few of these are engaging with conversations with pastoralists and with pastoral contexts, which is why we produced this report and why we encourage you all to read it.